Kei te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere aki nei, Chris Hipkins may have filled one situation vacant, but businesses are still struggling to get staff. It's top of their fix-it list for the new PM, who made industry leaders his top priority today. So what does it take to fill a hospo job? Well, a $5,000 signing bonus, according to one boss who joins us on the program. We talked to an economist and a cafe owner about the living wage. Also, did we mention rents are higher than ever? That's if you can find a place. And can the Coromandel get a break? One of its main roads is falling apart and nasty weather is rolling in for the long weekend. Don't forget, you can watch us live on the RNZ website, Facebook and Freeview Channel 50. RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Ahi Marie, good afternoon. I'm Evie Ashton. The Prime Minister says he won't rule out changes to the immigration settings to combat the country's labour shortage. Chris Hipkins met with business leaders in Auckland today, saying the meeting was positive and optimistic. He says part of the conversation was about getting more New Zealanders into the workforce, but potential changes to immigration are a definite possibility. Mr Hipkins says he wants to get off on the right foot with Auckland businesses, recognising this as a priority. This afternoon, the Prime Minister attended the tangi for Māori activist Te Whai Harawira, saying she has changed Aotearoa, New Zealand. Chris Hipkins spoke in front of hundreds of mourners at Hoani Waititi Marae in West Auckland to celebrate the life of the Ngāpuhi matriarch.
And we would not be here today without her. I know New Zealand would not be the same without her. But her legacy is not lost. It'll continue to be shared through her stories.
Te Whai Harawira was a pioneer for Māori rights. Gisborne's mayor says they're investigating the origins of wood debris on their beaches. It comes after a child died yesterday at Waikanai Beach. Rehet Stoltz says investigations were already underway before the death.
Council have been investigating and will carry out investigations on woody debris on our beaches, and that will continue.
Rehet Stoltz says the investigations are part of the council's process following extreme weather events, such as those the Tairāwhiti area has experienced recently. President Volodymyr Zelensky has welcomed the decision by Washington and Berlin to send advanced tanks to Ukraine. Germany's pledge to send its Leopard tanks also allows other countries to send them from their own inventory. The BBC's Jonathan Beale considers whether this could be a turning point in the war.
At the start of the war, the West's focus was on sending defensive weapons to Ukraine, such as shoulder-launched anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. That slowly evolved to more heavy weaponry. Western tanks are seen as an important element for future offensive operations. They'll provide Ukraine with more protection, accuracy and speed. In recent weeks, the West has also pledged to send scores more artillery guns and other armoured vehicles, as well as mine-breaching and bridge-laying capabilities.
People in northern Aotearoa are being urged to prepare for heavy rain arriving for the start of the Auckland anniversary weekend. Met Service has issued heavy rain and strong wind warnings and watches for Auckland, Northland Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Mount Taranaki. A low pressure system sitting to the northwest of the country is dragging down subtropical air. Communications meteorologist Lewis Ferris says it's bringing warm, humid air to Te Waipounamu and significant rainfall to parts of the North Island.
We have just issued a whole new fleet of severe weather warnings for rain and also some blustery winds as they enter into that Auckland long weekend. So not so great for them, but warm temperatures looking to stick around down south.
Several activities have already been cancelled due to the forecast weather and sea swells. Central Otago is the hottest place in the country this afternoon, with Alexandra hitting 29 degrees. Met Service predicts it could hit 30 degrees in the next few hours before starting to cool off. Te Waipounamu is also claiming the lowest temperature, with Franz Joseph reaching just 16.5 degrees. Communications meteorologist Lewis Ferris says the South Island should prepare for hot days to stick around into next week, despite some showers tomorrow. And a popular Wellington beach has been closed temporarily after a shark was spotted this afternoon. Wellington Council says a shark was spotted by a lifeguard on Lyell Bay at about 1 o'clock. The beach was reopened 2 hours ago. Now to sport, and Blues coach and former All Black Leon MacDonald is unconvinced by England Rugby's move to implement new tackle laws. From July, all players in grades below the English Premiership will only be able to tackle from the waist down in a bid to reduce head knocks. Many coaches in England believe the new law isn't practical, and MacDonald would have reservations if New Zealand Rugby look to follow suit.
It just feels it's sort of contrary to the essence of the game a little bit, but I understand why. It's a big move though, isn't it? You know, that will change the game completely, and what I'd love to see is the evidence behind it. I know there's been talk around, I had some concussions and a lot of mine when I did go low, so I'd love to see the numbers on that, and then I'd love to see the trials and the numbers that come out of it to show that it's either working or not.
Former world number one Victoria Azarenka resumes her quest for a third Australian Tennis Open title tonight when she plays Kazakhstan's Elena Rybakina in the semi-finals in Melbourne. The other semi-final features fifth seed Aryna Sabalenka against the unseeded Pole Magda Linette. New Zealand's world number 4, Joelle King, has been beaten in straight games in the semi-finals of the Tournament of Champions squash tournament in New York, going down to top seed Noran Goha. And Manchester United has beaten Nottingham Forest 3-0 in their League Cup football semi-final first leg match. That's the news.
For shoppers, the price shocks keep coming.
I just noticed that the price of ice cream just really jumped, so I'm pretty much not buying as much dairy and not buying as much meat.
While the Finance Minister says the worst may be behind us.
Well, I think inflation's peaked, and most commentators yesterday when they saw those numbers would say that.
But the opposition's not buying it.
Well, I certainly hope so, because we've now spent 3/4 of the year over 7%.
We've got the numbers. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And we're funded through New Zealand On Air. You're back with Lisa Owen next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Friday. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Cloud increasing. Rain with heavy falls developing in Northland this evening, spreading south tomorrow with possible thunderstorms for Northland and Auckland. From Waikato to Taranaki, including the Central High Country, partly cloudy today. Rain tomorrow for Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Fine, apart from isolated showers in Gisborne and in the Hawke's Bay Ranges. Showers increasing everywhere tomorrow. Whanganui to Wellington, also Wairarapa. Mainly fine with isolated showers today. Rain spreading south tomorrow. Bulla, Nelson and Marlborough, partly cloudy, isolated showers. Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms gradually clearing from the south tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine, isolated showers with possible thunderstorms in Canterbury today. Showers developing in Southland tomorrow morning, then spreading north, but showers clearing in the south later. And Reakohu, Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. The time is 7 minutes past 5. I will have news headlines and traffic news for you at 20 past 5.
Nā mihi Evie, tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki Checkpoint i tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. New Prime Minister Chris Hipkins has just filled the country's biggest situation vacant, but businesses aren't finding it as easy to get staff. Some, particularly in hospitality, are having to supersise job offers to get workers, with one offering a $5,000 sign-on bonus, and we'll have more on that shortly. Meanwhile, industry heavyweights told Chris Hipkins labour shortages are one of their top concerns when he sat down with them at the Auckland Business Chamber. This was his first public engagement in the new job, choosing to get down to business with business first. Our reporter Finn Blackwell and cameraman Nick Monroe were there.
In a cramped room with Auckland top brass, the new Prime Minister was in our largest city to hear what's bugging business and how to sort it. Among those meeting with Chris Hipkins, Fonterra's CEO, bank bosses, Auckland Airport and other commerce leaders.
Good morning, and it's great to see Prime Minister. We've packed them in like sardines for you.
I did say we wanted to get closer to business. So.
CEOs told Chris Hipkins staff shortages are their biggest problem as they discussed solutions for the forecast recession. The meeting continued behind closed doors, but the PM later said he had a clear message for those struggling.
We want businesses to thrive in New Zealand so that they can create good, well-paying jobs for New Zealanders so that Kiwi families can get ahead. And we will back New Zealand businesses to do that. They've given feedback on issues like wanting certainty in some key government policy areas, and I'll be working to make sure we can give them the certainty that they're looking for as quickly as possible.
Chris Hipkins recognising Auckland business as a priority.
Auckland is incredibly important to the New Zealand economy, a lot of the hub of commerce for New Zealand really, and it's also of course our gateway to the world for a very significant proportion of the people who come to and from New Zealand. So it's great to have an opportunity to have dialogue with the business community about the issues that are on top for them.
Changes to immigration settings in a bid to ease the labour shortage, a definite possibility.
I certainly wouldn't rule out further changes. The conversation that I had with the business community, though, was about making sure that we're getting the balance right between activating the New Zealand workforce, getting Kiwis into work, particularly thinking about that up to 10% of young New Zealanders at the moment who aren't engaged.
Auckland Business Chamber Chief Executive Simon Bridges says meeting with businesses on his second day was a strong start for Hipkins' leadership.
Both sides gave as good as they got, and very candid, very frank, and that was excellent.
He says there are clear issues across Auckland and the rest of the country that need addressing.
There were a bunch of issues around workers, skills, unskilled workers, the immigration settings, the need for training. Education was quite a strong topic, and you might be surprised about that when you think this is business leaders, but a really clear sense that in the long run, that's one of the things that really matters.
Chris Hipkins says he wants to get back to basics with New Zealand business, but most are already feeling the pinch of inflation and staffing shortages. Oscar works at La Noisette Bakery on Karangahape Road and says they need more than just new staff.
It's more than staff shortage, it's just about the skilled staff that we require.
She says rising inflation is making everything so much harder.
The egg shortages bring everyone a shock, like we only allow 30 eggs for a day. How can a bakery rely on 30 eggs a day? Which was crazy.
Businesses in our biggest city hoping changes ease the pressure, with an economic storm looming.
And the video version of that story will be on our website. So, labour shortages top of the fix-it list for business. Many are already paying above the minimum wage. Fast food giant Restaurant Brands that operates KFC and Pizza Hut is advertising for drivers, promising $10 minimum per delivery and up to $40 an hour. Flynn Drummond, General Manager of the Nelson Entertainment Complex Action Centre, is among those who've had to sweeten the deal to find someone for his situation vacant.
So a duty manager's role, essentially a customer service role and generally just operating the day-to-day front of house at our business.
And what kind of package did you have to entice people in?
Well, it's been pretty bad. In September last year, I started actually looking at going through a recruitment agency and bringing in foreign workers. And it was going to cost about $13,500 per person to get them in. And I thought, what can I offer to get some, sourced locally? So I put up an advert with a signing bonus, a healthy signing bonus and a good wage.
What was the signing bonus that you were offering?
$5,000 for that one.
Right, that's quite chunky, right? People will look at that and think that's a lot of cash. But when you compared it to the costs of finding someone, bringing someone from overseas, it was a reasonable alternative?
Yeah, and I mean it's a really tough one. It's not just the shortage of staff; it's actually getting quality people. And $5,000 may seem like a lot of money. But if I'm getting someone I know can run my business when I'm not here, is it really so much to pay? And obviously the fact that I had my back against the wall, I was looking at bringing in, foreign workers, and the cost was outrageous. So, it's worked out well.
In terms of that deal, did you say to people you have to stay for a year in order to collect, or can you give us an idea of the general terms and conditions?
Yeah, half on signing and then the other half after 8 months of service. Yeah.
So why is it so hard to get people? Because you're also paying more than the minimum wage, considerably more for that job, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean that's the problem. I think a lot of people will see hospitality as a job that anyone can do, and I get a lot of parents calling up like, "Oh, I've got my 14-year-old daughter who wants a job," and I'm like, "Okay, have you? She got any experience? No, and then they want $22 an hour. It's sort of it's changing, and to have good people, you got to pay the dollars, don't you?
So I know you'd been looking for a while, you'd had other positions. Had you had signing packages that were even bigger than that on offer and still couldn't get anyone?
Yeah, I did have, as I say, when it was really dire, I had offered someone quite a bit more than that, which at the time I didn't really have an option, and they turned it down. So.
Okay, not going to squeeze you for too many details, but more than 10 grand?
Oh, around about.
Yeah. So what do you say to businesses, Flynn, who say they simply cannot afford to pay over the minimum wage?
Yeah, and that's the problem with the competitive job market that we have at the moment. I think a lot of hospitality, their standards have just slipped, and they're saying, "Oh, well, we're going to pay someone minimum wage, and we're probably not going to offer as good a product." Whereas I like to hope that we can keep our standards high and have good people. So it's a real dogfight in hospo for staff at the moment. People are being headhunted, and it's just like a lot of other industry.
Is it sustainable then, this kind of, it's an auction almost to get workers, isn't it? So is it sustainable, and do you just end up passing the cost on to your customers?
Yeah, so, off the bat, no, I haven't had a price increase for 14 months. So, look, I think there is a ceiling, and we're pretty close to that ceiling, I hope. But at the same time, there's a huge change, and from September last year through to now, there's becoming a lot more people in the market seeking jobs. So I think this year it's going to be not so much as an employees market later in the year. Hopefully it'll be quite even keel.
Flynn, we've got a new Prime Minister. He's really interested in the challenges facing business. So what do you reckon? If you had 2 minutes with him, what would you tell him is the number one thing that you've got problems with right now?
Well, I think probably the migration one's the elephant in the room, isn't it? I think that's probably what everyone thinks. Just let's open our borders up and see what happens. It can only be good.
And just so everybody knows, you got someone to fill that job, did you?
Yeah, I have. Yes, very happy, very happy.
And that's Flynn Drummond. We'd love to hear from you. If you are trying to get workers into your business, are you offering incentives that are over and above? What kind of wage are you paying? Are you giving sign-up bonuses? Let us know your thoughts on all of that. 2101 on text. Tweet us at checkpoint.rnz. The email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. 17 minutes after 5. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Rents have hit record highs according to new figures from Trade Me. It's crunched the numbers on its rental ads last year and says every region except Wellington saw increases in rents. Northland had the biggest jump. Jonty Dine has more.
Xenia Ji arrived in New Zealand from China last week and did not anticipate such difficult and costly accommodation.
All the blue sky, beautiful clouds and green plants everywhere, I was full of hope. I was so excited. But after a few days that I just couldn't find the proper place to rent. Now I start to feel very nervous.
Xenia says her budget has significantly limited her options.
I don't want to spend too much on accommodation, so I just set up the price like between 200 to 230. Not too, it's quite cheap.
She says the competition is tight and places are being snapped up quickly. This Auckland renter says the search for a home has been exhausting.
We are planning to settle down soon and get with our lives and work, but still being a hustle to find a place.
She says rental prices have become almost out of reach.
Kind of little over our budget, but we don't have any other choice.
Trade Me Property Sales Director Gavin Lloyd says some regions, especially Northland, are under real pressure, particularly in having enough rental stock.
Manawatu Hanganui increased by $45 year on year. Taranaki close behind it, 40, and then the same thing with Canterbury there. So we've seen increases right the way through the country. The exceptions actually being our main centres, Auckland and Wellington.
Renters United President Geordie Rogers says landlords are able to increase rent to unsustainable levels without any consequence.
It certainly doesn't surprise me. It wasn't that long ago that we had the same conversation where everyone said, hold your horses, rent prices are going to go down. People still need a place to live. Landlords still have a very large monopoly over those places, and so people will pay whatever they can to make sure they have somewhere to live.
Mr Rogers says landlords have too much power to increase prices.
Landlords are freely available to increase rent prices to cover their own costs without considering or having to justify the extra pressures that puts on renters throughout the country.
Sasha Green, National Advisor for the Citizens Advice Bureau, says they receive regular calls about high rent.
We're seeing concerns about rent increases coming through in our inquiries to CABs around the country. People are struggling with meeting everyday needs, buying food, and to have rent increases on top of that is absolutely unsustainable.
The government has removed the ability for landlords to claim a tax reduction on interest on rental income. National Deputy Leader Nicola Willis says that means they're paying more tax than ever, which is hurting tenants.
The government has been warned by its advisors that those costs get passed on. We're seeing that in practice. Rents went up around $50 in the past year, 4.4%.
The rental price creep that's putting more pressure on tenants' budgets.
And that was Jonty Dine reporting. It's 5:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program so far. Let us know what's going on with your rent. Have you had a rise recently? And tell us about the price. 2101 on text. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Already some of you getting in touch about the worker shortage and whether more immigration is a good idea. Do let us know your thoughts on that one as well. It is time to go to the headlines now. Ko ewe anō tēnei.
The Prime Minister says changes to immigration are a definite possibility to ease the country's labour shortage. But Chris Hipkins says part of the conversation is about getting more New Zealanders into the workforce. He was speaking after meeting business leaders in Auckland. This afternoon, the Prime Minister attended the tangi for Māori activist Te Whai Harawira, saying she changed Aotearoa New Zealand. Hundreds of mourners are at Hoani Waititi Marae in West Auckland to celebrate the life of Ms Harawira, who died on Tuesday aged 90. She was a pioneer for Māori rights in the 1970s and a leader in the hikoi or march to Parliament in 1975. 2 people are injured after a car collided with a train in Invercargill this afternoon. Emergency services were called to the rail crossing at Renfrew Street near Drury Lane shortly after 3:30. Central Otago is the hottest place in the country this afternoon, with Alexandra hitting 29 degrees. Communications meteorologist Lewis Ferris says the South Island should prepare for hot days to stick around into next week. Meanwhile, Met Service has issued heavy rain and strong wind warnings for Auckland, Northland, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Mount Taranaki. And Wellington's Lyall Bay Beach was closed temporarily this afternoon after a shark sighting. The beach was reopened at 3 o'clock. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic, some traffic news in the South Island. State Highway 76, Christchurch's southern motorway. There's a crash between southbound between the Wrights Road overbridge and Curlitz Road off-ramp. Expect delays. And for the North Island, with heavy rain coming our way, the condition of those scary cracks on State Highway 25A, the Kopu-Hikuwai Road in the Coromandel won't be getting any better. The road is still open between 7am and 7pm, but caution is advised. Our next news headlines and traffic is at 5:40.
We'll have more on those scary cracks later in the bulletin. We're going to talk to the Mayor from over there, so do stay tuned. Former All Black and Blues Super Rugby coach Leon McDonald has weighed in on the international debate about lowering tackle heights. From this season, New Zealand's community rugby players will need to tackle tackle below the sternum. England Rugby has taken this even further, changing the rules to outlaw tackles above the waist in amateur grades. McDonald says he's still to be convinced about the changes.
It just feels it's sort of contrary to the essence of the game a little bit, but I understand why. It's a big move though, isn't it? You know, that will change the game completely, and I don't know if the game needs big overhauls right now. What I'd love to see is the evidence behind it. I know there's been talk around, you know, I had some concussions and a lot of mine when I did go low, so I'd love to see the numbers on that, and then I'd love to see the trials and the numbers that come out of it to show that it's either working or not.
We're joined now by sports reporter Felicity Reid. Interesting comments, Felicity. So, New Zealand Rugby locked in those changes late last year with very little fanfare. So why is it causing so much discussion overseas?
Well, going below the sternum raised a few eyebrows, but it's actually going below, well, nothing above the waist, right? That's quite a drastic change. And that's sort of targeting those taller players, and a lot has been made around how they would actually be able to adapt to that. And as you just heard from Leon McDonald there, he says in his opinion, taking a tackle lower is actually been a cause for concussion. And players are saying that it's like whether a hip or a knee to the head is just about as bad as a high tackle. And overseas that these high-profile players and coaches have actually taken this up as well. And so in England, a lot of the clubs which would be playing under this under-the-waist rule, they've sort of really called out the England Rugby Union about what this actually means. And for them, they're losing a lot of players to the game as well. And so they sort of see this as another factor which will drive people away. And that's, I guess, as well, it's the communication of that type of thing. Maybe in New Zealand it was communicated to these clubs through trials a little bit better than perhaps it has been overseas. But these clubs in England which are complaining do actually have the backing of Ireland's captain Johnny Sexton and their head coach Andy Farrell, who agree that taking that lower tackle is actually putting players at risk. You're going to have more players at risk of injury if you do sort of switch to this new nothing above the waist situation. This has sort of transcended rugby over there as well. The England Test cricket captain, Ben Stokes, has spoken out against it. Not sure what his background particularly in that is, but maybe it's talking about safety for athletes would be a high priority for him. And the public have got behind it as well. 30,000 have signed an online petition in one day. So it's really sort of racked up people over there as well, and maybe brought more attention to how they'll be playing rugby.
Yeah, but I suppose it still leaves the open-ended question. Then how do you lower head injuries? You've got players taking a class action for dementia and brain injuries. You know, you can't just do nothing, can you?
No, exactly. I think everyone involved in this doesn't want to see more head injuries, and maybe it's more around the communication or the way, or finding perhaps that happy medium between what would be considered a safer way to encourage people to tackle. It's like, as I mentioned, that Johnny Sexton and Andy Farrell are talking around tackle technique and the importance of that, as opposed to maybe where on the body you are tackling.
Okay, another spat, right? This one's a different kind, broken out between two of golf's big names. Who threw the golf tee and why?
This is the latest in that fractious civil war between the LIV golfers and the PGA golfers. World number one Rory McIlroy was at a golf range in Dubai, and Patrick Reed, American Patrick Reed, he popped up to say hello. Rory didn't really want to hear from him and ignored him, snubbed him completely. Patrick Reed took exception to this and threw the golf tee at him, which all sounds a bit childish and a bit of a schoolyard scrap, really. But I guess that, and Reed completely acknowledges that. He says, well, McIlroy was being childish and that was why he acted in that way. But we can hear from McIlroy in his own words of why he gave Reed the cold shoulder.
I was subpoenaed by his lawyer on Christmas Eve. So, I mean, of course, I'm just trying to have a nice time with my family, and you know, someone shows up on your doorstep and delivers that, you know, you're not take that well. So I'm living in reality. I don't know where he's living, but if I were in his shoes, I wouldn't expect a hello or a handshake either.
And that subpoena there that Rory mentions actually came from a member of Reed's legal team, and it alleges an antitrust violation, claiming that McIlroy, Tiger Woods, Davis Love III and the PGA are all working together to destroy LIV Golf.
That puts a whole other slant on it, that little piece of information. Thank you, Felicity. Felicity Reid there with Sports News. Coromandel Peninsula could be in for a double whammy this long weekend, with nasty weather on the way and heavy travel restrictions on the popular but badly damaged State Highway 25A. Waka Kotahi is waiting on the results of a geotechnical report after massive cracks appeared on the road. And that's used to get to a heap of holiday spots on the peninsula. And Waka Kotahi can't give a time for a fix. One weekend event's already been cancelled due to forecast bad weather. 2 long weekends are looming. and would normally bring an influx of visitors, but to complicate things further, State Highway 25A is only open between 7am and 7pm, is down to one lane and has a stop-go system operating. Well, joining us now is Coromandel Mayor Len Salt. Kia ora, Len. You must be wondering if you could get a break sometime soon.
Kia ora, Lisa. You're not wrong. It's certainly been a wild, since the beginning of the year, and we've been hammered pretty hard. So, yes, you're not wrong.
So what do locals think of the situation with the highway to start with?
Look, our Coromandel locals are pretty resilient. We've always been accustomed to these events, but this year, in particular, the start of this year, we're shaping up to around a metre of rain between the 1st of January and now. And normally it would take us to the middle of the year, to May, June, before we get rain at those levels. What it does is it puts an enormous amount of pressure on the hills, on the roading network that we've got. This incident that we've got, or the cracking that's appeared on the Kopu Hekawai, has exacerbated the situation because that's currently closed between 7pm and 7am. If we get a rain event that closes the Kopu Hekawai during the daytimes, then what it will do, it will force the closure of two of the gravel roads that cross between the west coast and the east coast. That's the Tapu Coroglen and the 309. And that is going to cause most of the traffic, or all of the traffic that needs to access the eastern coast, round the top of the peninsula, down through Coromandel and down through that way. That obviously is a problem for us, and we'd like to avoid that happening if we can.
Yeah, because you could have a complete gnarl-up. What discussions are you having with Waka Kotahi? Because they seemed unable to provide a timeline for or suggest what kind of fix is going to be needed for the road, waiting on this geotech report.
Yeah, same discussions, I'm afraid, Lisa. We're waiting on the geotech, and I drove through the other day, a couple of days ago. They were doing the geotech at the time. It is a significant area of damage. There are significant implications. We don't have those answers yet, I'm afraid.
So now, I imagine, would be the time where your businesses, they make hay while the sun shines, or should shine. So they've been hammered by COVID and not so many people travelling. They would have been hoping that this was going to be the big summer. How worried are people that this is going to put travellers off?
They're concerned. Obviously, there has been a significant impact on our businesses. A lot of the businesses rely on that weekend holiday summer visitor numbers. That's how they make their revenue through the winter period. It's pretty quiet. So, yes, there has been an impact, and we are really feeling for our local businesses. Some of the people, the visitors that are in town and the locals, they will tend to go to a restaurant or shopping or to the movies, but a lot of our activity is outdoor activity, beaches, walking tracks, cycling. All of that stuff is affected by these events, and it's tough.
Someone got in touch with us last night asking what provision had been made for medical emergencies if this road is closed from 7pm. Are you able to enlighten us?
So that's one of the reasons why we keep a close eye on the Tapu Coroglen and the 309 roads, because those access roads tend to get used by heavy traffic as alternative access routes from west to east coast. Now, if we have to close the Kopu Hekawai and heavy traffic is forced onto those roads, then it has implications for emergency vehicles. We do need to talk to Waka Kotahi about keeping access for emergency vehicles open through the Kopu Hekawai, and we're having those discussions with them at the moment.
You mean through the night, Len? So that
through the night.
Yeah,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You live on a peninsula, right? So it's open to extreme weather, but your infrastructure seems incredibly fragile. Should it be this bad?
So that is a really good question, Lisa, and what you've done is identified a conversation that we've already started with the government. I wrote to the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago before she stood down, but essentially the letter's gone to the Prime Minister's office and said, look, our infrastructure is really, really being hammered by these events, by the increasing severity. the increasing frequency of these events. We need to look at a plan for improving the access roads, improving the infrastructure, and providing more resilience in a time of climate change where we can expect these events to happen more often.
Appreciate your time, Len. That's Len Salt, who is the Coromandel Mayor. It is 27 minutes to 6. Kia amo tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Time for the business news now. Ko taku hoa e nai ko Nona Peltier. Nona, tougher economic conditions and threats of a recession are stifling growth for fledgling businesses. What's going on with that?
Yeah, we've been hearing about this for a while, that we don't see as much venture capital being invested into higher risk investments, such as startup companies, those that are looking for, say, second stage investment and so on. Part of the reason is that when you invest your money into one of these smaller companies, there's not a lot of liquidity. It's not the same as putting in the share market and there's 100,000 or a million shares and there's plenty of turnover. So it's a longer term commitment, and in economic downturn, people tend to be a little bit more cautious. So we're not seeing as much money coming in. That's affecting some of our crowdfunding platforms. For example, Pledge Me is talking about that. They're saying that even though they funded, $70 million over a decade to help startup companies get going, these days it's becoming a little bit more tricky to get that money. So that's hard for companies that are wanting to grow, because remembering that a lot of these companies are growth companies. It's difficult. They need cash flow. Growth is really cash flow intensive, and you're not going to get very far without that cash. So we'll see what happens with that sector. Maybe a bit of a slowdown there, perhaps some additional more mergers and other ways that these smaller companies can survive by helping each other better.
Okay, job losses among global technology giants are mounting. Is it just an overseas thing?
No. Look, there's 150,000 jobs that have been laid off, basically, from the likes of Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon. Lots of job losses coming. And these are, by and large, tech sector jobs. But tech sector employees have been in demand in New Zealand for a long time, but they're also in demand in other countries, Australia too. So even though there's a lot of unemployed people out there looking for work, and New Zealand does look like a nice place to come and live, it's not cheap to live here, and our salaries are not as competitive as they are, say, in Australia. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to fill all the jobs that we have going. But because I've just said, slow down in growth and so on with these startup companies, it gives tech companies here in New Zealand a bit of a break. So maybe they don't need as many staff members. They don't have to lay off staff. So I think we're in a better position than we're seeing elsewhere. How long that lasts? It's a very fast-changing industry, the dynamics there. A lot of tech sector workers, though, can work from overseas locations. So it could be that this is going to help our industry here. We have been crying out for tech sector workers for a long time. That's one of the critical shortages that we have.
Okay, let's do a whip around the markets.
Let's do that. Okay, so look, the NZX Top 50 Index, it rose 0.25%, and that's in line with what we saw in Asia. It's pretty much back to full steam. China's still out for the holidays. Australia is, of course, enjoying its Australia Day holiday, so that's kind of seen volumes fall a little bit. But still, 0.25% up, 29-point gain to 12,023. That's over the 11,000 mark, just so you know. And the New Zealand dollar, it's a little changed. 64.9 US cents. That's just basically...
A little bit down.
Yeah. And 91.2 Australian, a little bit down there, and 52.3 British pence. But really, overall, hardly changed at all.
Thank you, Nona. Nona Peltier with Business News there. Returning to our earlier story about labour shortages and the cost of attracting and keeping staff. The Council of Trade Unions is calling for the minimum wage to be raised about, almost $2.50 an hour to $23.65 to match the living wage. National's finance spokesperson, Nicola Willis, has advised caution, suggesting the minimum wage is already high enough and any further jump would fuel inflation. Well, joining us now is economist Shamabel Jacob from Sense Partners. Tēnā koe, Shamabel.
Kia.
$23.65 an hour, the equivalent of the living wage, is that affordable?
Well, we've always had these big questions around when the minimum wage increases. Are we going to see mass business closures, or are we going to see mass inflation? Both of those things haven't happened in the past. The difference now, of course, is the minimum wage is now relatively high compared to the median or normal wages that we see in New Zealand. So the pressures are building.
And that would be a significant jump, right? Almost $2.50. Would it be inflationary if we put that money into people's pockets?
Well, given the intense labour shortages that we're seeing in the industries that are likely to experience it, so in things like horticulture, retail, hospitality, I'm not entirely sure that it is going to be a big binding constraint. And the reason I say that is for them to be able to attract workers right now, the minimum wage is simply not enough.
Okay, so small businesses would argue that they've had a pretty tough few years. If they can't afford to pay an increase at the $23.65 an hour point, do we just accept that some of them will fail and that is a reset?
Well, listen, again, this is the thing, right? Every time we have a conversation about the minimum wage, we go, there's going to be all these business failures. But we never seem to have the big, bout of business failures. I think the main thing that tends to happen when there's an increase in minimum wages is most of the businesses in that sector, usually around retail, hospitality, things like cleaning and horticulture, all the providers increase their prices if they can. And generally speaking, they can because where else are you going to go? You're still going to buy your coffee, right, if you want it.
That takes us into that cycle, though, doesn't it, right? So we've got 7.2% inflation at the moment. We put up, across the board, let's say, the minimum wage by almost $2.50. You say it gets bumped on to the consumers, so they're spending more money, and round we go.
It does, and as long as the economy is strong enough, right? And so we get the business closures or the reduction in profit margins when the economy is not that strong. And I think that's where a lot of the concerns will be coming this year, that the economy is feeling pretty weak. Consumer confidence is very low. Business confidence is very low. I'd be very surprised if the government came along and said, we're going to give a inflation or inflation plus increase in minimum wages in this environment. Especially given an election year, they would like to make sure that they're keeping everybody happy, including the business sector.
So it's a political decision rather than one of whether we can actually afford it or sustain it or not.
Of course, it's always a political decision. And the reality is that for the workers on minimum wages, more often than not, the increase in the minimum wage is not the increase in the take-home pay. Because if you have, most of these people are on such low incomes that they're getting other benefits too. And more often than not, that increase in wages will be eaten up by loss of entitlements elsewhere. So we've got lots of other work we could do in policy that would actually help low-income earners more than increasing the minimum wage.
Like what? Give us your top suggestion.
Well, the first thing is really around the abatement rates on things like working for families. That really affects working mothers in particular when it comes to increases in minimum wage. And we should absolutely deal with things like working for families, which makes it so expensive for people to work.
Okay, well, there's been talk about labour shortages today. The new Prime Minister meeting with business. They're saying it's the kind of number one thing on the fix-it list for him. And some suggesting that we need to open up our borders for more immigrant workers. Is that part of the solution?
Well, New Zealand has long relied on immigration to fill our skills gaps. But it's not a panacea because when people come, that also increases demand. The reality is that right now we're dealing with this incredible demand for workers, but across the business community we're seeing job ads starting to fall, especially since kind of about October, November last year. And that means that I think there's less urgency to kind of open up the floodgates per se, but being really focused on areas of intense labour shortages. In places like health in particular, I think we really need to get moving pretty fast.
But do you generally think we're at a sweet spot then with the immigration settings, with the exception of those industries or areas, like you've just mentioned, health, who are crying out for workers?
Well, I think New Zealand's never had a proper conversation about what immigration is for. We kind of use it as a political tool to deal with whatever we want to at the time. Currently, it happens to be that it's labour shortages. 10 years ago, it was because we wanted population growth and economic growth. And I think it's really unfair to play use immigrants as this little political chess pieces. We need to be a little bit more structured around what we want it for. That would create more certainty both for the immigrants and for the businesses in New Zealand. And right now, neither political party is providing that.
Good to talk to you, Shamabil. That's Shamabil Jacob from Sense Partners. It is 13 minutes to 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program. Rents, minimum wage, living wage, immigration. Got a lot of thoughts pouring in. Do join the debate, 2101 on text. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. And our email address, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Evie is standing very by. Anaya Evie, mena pita kōrero.
Kia ora, Lisa. 2 people have been injured after a car collided with the train in Invercargill this afternoon. Emergency services were called to the Renfrew Street crossing at about 3:40 p.m. Kiwi Rail Operations Executive General Manager Paul Ashton said a vehicle collided with a shunt train on a level crossing that was fitted with flashing lights and bells. Prime Minister Chris Hipkins says he won't rule out immigration changes to fix the country's labour shortage, but he says part of the conversation is about getting more New Zealanders into the workforce. The origins of wood debris on Gisborne's beaches is being investigated after a child's death yesterday evening. Gisborne Mayor Rehet Stoltz says the probe was already underway before the death at Waikanai Beach. Police say the death will be referred to the coroner. Russia's calling the decision by the United States and Germany to send tanks to Ukraine a blatant provocation. The US will send 31 battle tanks, while Germany will send 14. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says they must arrive ahead of an expected new Russian offensive. Dutch prosecutors have arrested a hacker suspected of stealing and selling the personal data of tens of millions of people around the world. The 25-year-old man was detained in Amsterdam in November, but it was kept quiet while investigations continued. And UN figures show opium production in Myanmar rose by a third last year, bucking an 8-year decline. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime put it down to rising economic hardship and political insecurity following the coup in 2020. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in Central Otago, State Highway 8 between Dumbarton and Roxburgh. A fire means stop-go traffic management is operating there. Speed has also been reduced to 30 k's. In Christchurch, State Highway 76 is down to 1 lane south-westbound between Wrights Road Overbridge and Curlitz Road off-ramp. Expect delays. And for the North Island in the Hawke's Bay, a crash earlier today has closed State Highway 50 north of Onga Onga at the intersection with Waikarara Road. Our next news and weather is at 6 o'clock.
Ngā mihi, Evie. Lots of feedback coming in on labour shortages, paying bonuses for people to sign up, and whether the minimum wage should go up. Gary says there are people living in New Zealand who are capable of filling the jobs and being upskilled to fill them. Another says, sick and tired of hearing about the immigration worker shortage when there are plenty of New Zealand workers like me struggling to get a decent paying job in New Zealand. Another says, hi there, open up migration. Well, where are all these folks going to live? Witness Q-Town, Queenstown. It doesn't all add up. Mike has got in touch to say, would it be a good idea to encourage tipping? Whoa, Mike, that is a whole other can of worms. People can let us know what they think of that one, 2101 on text. This one, there's a feeling paths will cross soon, says this listener. Certain sectors crying out for more staff. Then on the other hand, some places are laying people off. Hopefully those laid off will stream towards the understaffed places if they have the skills. Another sums up the sentiments of many who are getting in touch. More immigrants won't help rent prices. Do keep your feedback coming, 2101 on text. 1 in 5 Kiwis are experiencing long COVID symptoms as the virus continues to cast a long shadow over the country. New research shows as many as 300,000 New Zealanders could be battling the post-viral illness. But patients and experts say there's no clear pathway to access treatment and are concerned for a health system that's already stretched thin. Louise Tanuth reports.
Daniel Freeman's been suffering long COVID for several months and things aren't getting any better. He's now reliant on an inhaler for the first time since childhood and battling debilitating brain fog.
Some days I'm bedbound, some days I'm housebound or couchbound, I guess. For instance, I could be sitting down, my resting heart rate could be somewhere in the late 70s. I can stand up and just stand completely still. Within 5 to 10 minutes of standing up, my heart rate will be 130 plus.
That forced him to leave his job in healthcare because of its physical demands. While he's grateful for some financial support from Work and Income, he's had to make some difficult decisions.
I've had to sell my home. I've moved back in with my parents in my mid-40s, and I'm living with my parents who are in their mid-70s, and basically a lot of the time they're having to help take care of me.
A Headinga Victoria University of Wellington study surveyed just under 1,000 people, and more than 20% of them reported long COVID symptoms. About half of those say the healthcare they received wasn't adequate, and they feel misunderstood. Last year, the Ministry of Health released guidelines for doctors to help diagnose long COVID, but Daniel says this hasn't improved patient care.
When I've sort of queried being referred to a cardiologist, I've basically just been told, well, listen, you'll have all these tests, a few of them will come out abnormal, but they'll basically shrug their shoulders and just say, we don't know what's going on, but you seem okay, see you later.
For some patients, physiotherapy is beneficial for breathlessness and fatigue. Lecturer at the New Zealand School of Physiotherapy, Sarah Rhodes, says a lot of clinics are treating patients.
Once there's an awareness that people are finding treatment in these services, the demand's going to increase and there just isn't the resource available.
She's calling for urgent funding for long COVID patients and dedicated long COVID clinics nationwide.
At the moment there is an absence of any cohesive response. So we are seeing some services being set up, but they're very ad hoc. They're predominantly in the private sector, which comes at a cost.
The Ministry of Health recommends a multidisciplinary approach for long COVID, with a range of health professionals from psychologists to occupational therapists. But Dr. Anna Brooks, who's studying long COVID, says there's no clear pathway to access treatment for patients.
The multidisciplinary team come to the patient, or someone assesses them for what type medical care they might need, rather than the patient needing to potentially book loads of different appointments with uncertainty.
And while there's so much unknown about long COVID, patients may not get any answers.
Post-viral illness is not part of medical training. There isn't a doctor trained. There's not a specialty to deal with these conditions. The specialists who are experts in this area took it upon themselves to understand.
Checkpoint has approached Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand for comment.
And that was Louise Tanuth reporting. It is 10 minutes to 6. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. There are celebrations and demonstrations around Australia today. Officially, it's Australia Day, but for many Indigenous people, it's remembered as Invasion Day, marking years of brutality under British rule. It comes as the country's about to vote in a referendum for Indigenous voices in Parliament. ABC reporter Carly Williams was at a Sydney rally.
It is the anniversary, the 85th anniversary of the first ever January 26 rally. It's known as the Day of Mourning. That conference happened at Australian Hall in Sydney's CBD on Gadigal land, not too far from where I'm standing now. And on that day, while Sydney-siders were celebrating 150 years since the British arrived, a group of Aboriginal men and women and their children gathered to protest 150 years of brutal mistreatment. They passed a motion asking for citizenship rights. It's this monumental day in Indigenous history. It's considered the birth point of the modern political Indigenous movement. And they talked about issues that mob and allies at protests like I'm at today are still fighting. Protesters are raising awareness around racial injustices, including the rising number of black deaths in custody and police mistreatment, land rights, climate change. People are opposing land clearing, oil and gas mining and water rights. But the overarching mood here is to reflect on an anniversary that is painful for many First Nations people.
Meanwhile, hundreds of Australians were honoured for serving their communities. The ABC's Noah Hardar was in Canberra.
The Australian of the Year for 2023 is Taryn Brumfitt.
For years, Adelaide woman Taryn Brumfitt has travelled the country spreading one message.
Australia, it is not our life's purpose to be at war with our body.
The body image activist, documentary maker, author and mother of four has been named the 2023 Australian of the Year. Her mission, to encourage children and adults to embrace their bodies.
We weren't born into the world hating our bodies. This is something the world has taught us. Body shaming is a universal problem, and we have been bullied and shamed into thinking our bodies are the problem.
As the nation readies for a referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament, this year's title of Senior Australian of the Year has been awarded to one of its biggest advocates, Professor Tom Calma. For more than 4 decades, the Cungarakan elder has championed the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at a local, national and international level. He used his acceptance speech to address senior Australians directly.
You are the demographic being targeted with misinformation by pundits who are either ill-informed or who have malicious intent regarding the voice.
And he called on all Australians to support the proposed constitutional change.
Let's do this together. Walk with us. Vote yes in the referendum.
Staff at Amazon in the UK are going on strike for the first time over a pay dispute. The online retail giant has been battling the rise of trade unions in its workforce for almost a year, saying it still doesn't recognise them in any nation where it operates. The BBC's Zoe Conway reports from Coventry.
It's one of the biggest retailers in the world, one of the biggest private sector employers in the UK.
There's a strike on today, I don't know if you saw it on the news.
And it's now facing its first ever strike here. Nicholas Henderson is one of the GMB union's newest recruits.
We are basically on the breadline. The time you add in your rent, your mortgage, your food, your bills, you basically got nothing left.
Workers here at the Coventry site were given a 50p pay rise in August, taking their minimum pay rate to £10.50 an hour. The union says it should be £15 an hour, arguing that the company's profits boomed during the pandemic, and so too the bank account of billionaire founder Jeff Bezos.
We don't want his boat or his rocket. We just want to be able to live.
Darren and Garfield work at the Coventry site and are leading today's action.
We just want a decent wage. We're on our feet for 10 hours a day. We get told off if we're caught leaning or sitting.
The Coventry site is similar to this Amazon centre in Essex. Garfield and Darren say their work is monitored. They have to meet targets. The pressure is intense.
As soon as you come in the building, you're tracked. You then go onto your station, where as soon as you log on, they know exactly where you are in the building. They know how often you're scanning. If you haven't scanned within a certain time, they will come and speak to you.
They both say they've been questioned by managers for taking too long to go to the toilet.
Heaven forbid you get there, all the cubicles are full. You suddenly find you've got 10 or 12 minutes of doing nothing other than look for a toilet, and then of course you've got to use the toilet and come back. That could be 15, 16, 18 minutes in that process. They will then question you, what were you doing?
Canterbury Museum has been taken over by urban artists, filling the space with colour for its blockbuster farewell exhibition. The historic building has been cleared out to enable a $200 million redevelopment over the next 5 years. The Shift Urban Art Takeover exhibition opens on Saturday and will run for 6 weeks. Our reporter Anna Sargent and cameraman Nathan McKinnon went for a look.
With Canterbury Museum's redevelopment not far away, most of the complex is empty, handed over to urban artists to use as their canvas. The museum will close in April for a major revamp. Before then, the public will have the chance to view the work of over 60 urban artists from New Zealand and the world, who have created a winding pathway of art across 5 floors and over 35 spaces. Exhibition curator and urban art expert Ruben Woods says the show is a unique experience.
I've been coming to the museum my whole life and to have seen it change in front of my eyes has been fascinating. So I think people will be amazed when they see the changes that have undergone here, that have taken place here at the museum.
Dr. Woods says artists were asked to respond to the museum and have done so in a variety of creative ways.
Some artists have responded to the museum's interests in collections and the history of the institution. Some have responded to the physical space.
One of the artists, who works under the name Chimp, says he was excited for the challenge of working in a museum context for the first time.
So I wanted to push the boundaries of my own practice and also urban art. So I wanted to do some sculpture, and I've used some of the recycled materials that they've basically had left behind from packing up at the museum. So I've made a bunch of kind of slot-like sculptures using a lot of the forms that I use in my work.
Museum director Anthony Wright says it's bittersweet to be leaving the building, but he's inspired by how the exhibition has come together.
This is such a cool thing to do in an empty museum. We don't know of any example in the world where a cultural institution has had to empty everything out for a major redevelopment and has allowed urban artists to come in and, if you like, take over the place with such an amazing variety of urban art.
He says the response from the urban art community has been fantastic.
The enthusiasm, the desire to do even more than what they were asked to do has been really terrific. So they've entered into the spirit of it really well. They're acting a little bit like guerrillas, urban guerrillas in a way, which I think is part of the makeup of urban art, but in a controlled kind of way. But I love the way that things pop up every day in unexpected places that we haven't ever talked about. And so far, they're all really cool.
The exhibition will run from this Saturday until April 11th, with tickets available on Canterbury Museum's website. Anthony Wright says all the proceeds will go towards the museum's redevelopment. Whilst the existing buildings are upgraded, the museum will open a pop-up site inside the Centre of Contemporary Art building in Christchurch's central city.
And if you'd like to look at some of the pictures of that exhibition being prepared, go onto our website. We'll put the video version of the story there for you. Let's get to some feedback on the minimum wage. Jim says, how is it that talk of raising the minimum wage sparks talk of business suffering, but if a landlord raises the rent, then a tenant is just assumed to be able to suck it up? And Jeff says, if a hospitality business can't pay the minimum wage, then its business model may be unrealistic. No one should be paid low wages, says Jeff. Another person says, I wonder why there is no relief for single people on lower brackets. I don't have a family, but still some help, especially tax breaks for lower incomes would be so helpful. I am not much over the minimum wage as I had to take a salary cut. Now we're going to have more on the minimum wage and the living wage after 6.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Ngā mihi o te pō. Good evening, I'm Evie Ashton. The Prime Minister says he won't rule out changes to the immigration settings to combat the country's labour shortages. Chris Hipkins met with business leaders in Auckland today, aiming to better engage with the issues facing the super city. He says part of the conversation was about getting more New Zealanders into the workforce, but he says potential changes to immigration are a definite possibility.
I certainly wouldn't rule out further changes. The conversation that I had with the business community, though, was about making sure that we're getting the balance right between activating the New Zealand workforce, getting Kiwis into work, particularly thinking about that up to 10% of young New Zealanders at the moment who aren't engaged.
Chris Hipkins says he wants to get off on the right foot with Auckland business, recognising it as a priority. Gisborne's mayor says she's heartbroken for the family of a child who died at Waikanae Beach. The child died yesterday after suffering an injury there. Rehet Stoltz says she, the council and the community are all sending their thoughts and prayers to the family.
I feel heartbroken for this family, and we can't even begin to understand the unimaginable loss. It is a sad day here in Gisborne.
Rehet Stoltz says the council will offer any support they can to the family. Auckland Council is warning campers to be vigilant this long weekend as bad weather is set to sweep the northern part of the North Island. Met Service has issued heavy rain and strong wind warnings for Auckland, Northland and Coromandel this morning. The council's regional parks manager Scott De Silva says people should keep an eye on the forecast, especially those intending to stay overnight in its campgrounds. The council is also warning holidaymakers to take care around the water and on the roads. The organiser of Auckland's Buskers Festival is hoping desperately the forecast will turn out to be wrong. The severe weather warnings in Auckland mean the possibility of having to cancel some of the annual anniversary weekend festival. Managing Director Pam Glaser says this would be heartbreaking as the performers have travelled from all over the world.
They from Korea, Japan, Italy, the States, Canada, they're from all over and they've come especially for our festival. So we're going to do everything we can to get them some shows.
Pam Glaser says they'll make the call each day on whether the performers can go ahead. Homeowners in Upper Hutt, north of Wellington, are dismayed at a nearly 37% increase in ratings valuations in the last 3 years. The average house value is now $852,000, though that amount is nearly $130,000 less than a peak in late 2021. One Upper Hutt retiree who doesn't want to be named says her home's value is up from almost $400,000 to $570,000, but she could never sell for that much. She says she'll be forced to sell it if the council raise her rates on top of her growing mortgage interest rates. A campaign to change the date of Australia Day, which falls on the anniversary of Britain's first fleet and the beginning of colonialism, has been gaining momentum. Invasion Day rallies are taking place all over Australia today. The BBC's Phil Mercer is at a demonstration in Sydney.
For these people on the march here in Sydney today, this is Invasion Day, a time of sorrow, a time of mourning, and a time to commemorate the arrival of those British ships 235 years ago. People here believe that that was the start of a brutal and lasting colonisation. This march in Sydney is being replicated in many other cities and towns across the country.
And urban artists have taken over Canterbury Museum, using the space as their canvas for the museum's blockbuster farewell exhibition. The historic building has been cleared out to enable a $200 million redevelopment over the next 5 years. Museum director Anthony Wright says it's bittersweet to be leaving the building, but he's inspired by how the exhibition has come together.
This is such a cool thing to do in an empty museum. We don't know of any example in the world where a cultural institution has had to empty everything out for a major redevelopment and has allowed urban artists to come in and, if you like, take over the place with such an amazing variety of urban art.
The exhibition will run for 6 weeks, beginning this Saturday, and Anthony Wright says all proceeds will go towards the museum's redevelopment. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, we welcome back Claire Concannon with Our Changing World, and tonight they're investigating the potential of greening our city walls, and they're looking for solutions for data storage, the healing power of forests in treating depression and addiction, and music with Lost and Found, lost classics and curious cuts from New Zealand and beyond. That's all on Nights with Karen Hay, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And we're on air, online and available through the RNZ app on your mobile phone. You're back with Lisa Owen next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Friday for Northland, Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Cloud increasing, rain with heavy falls developing in Northland this evening, spreading south tomorrow with possible thunderstorms for Northland and Auckland. From Waikato to Taranaki, including the central high country, partly cloudy today, rain tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine apart from isolated showers in Gisborne and the Hawke's Bay ranges. Showers increasing everywhere tomorrow. From Whanganui to Wellington, also for Wairarapa, mainly fine with isolated showers today. Rain spreading south tomorrow. Bulla, Nelson and Marlborough, partly cloudy with isolated showers. Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms gradually clearing from the south tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine, but isolated showers with possible thunderstorms in Canterbury today. Showers developing in Southland tomorrow morning, then spreading north, but showers clearing in the south later. And for Te Kohu, Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. The time is 6 minutes past 6. I'll have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Awfully cheery weather report there. Thanks, Evie. No mai hoki mai, this is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. The minimum wage needs to jump up almost $2.50 an hour to match the living wage, according to the Council of Trade Unions. That would take it to $23.65 an hour. The Prime Minister says the government will be discussing any annual adjustments over the next couple of weeks. Pukekohe Business, your local coffee roasters, already pays the living wage. Owner Ria Lingad is on the line. Hi, Ria.
Hi, Lisa.
How have you managed?
Having me.
Thank you for being with us. How have you managed to do this?
The living wage?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have been doing it for a little over a year now. We've always paid our staff above the minimum wage, which I think is fair. We're very conscious of our business, like our numbers every week, and we are able to afford the living wage because of I guess we're in tune with our business, and we know that we're able to meet our sales and we're able to meet our costs. And yeah, so at the moment, it all works out.
So your business model is based on allowing for this higher wage than others pay?
Yes. So even when we started this business, I base it on how many people do I need and how much sales do I need to generate to be able to pay our employees properly. So ever since, it was our basis.
So you started doing this during COVID, Ria?
Yes, we did.
So how hard was that then?
For our business, it wasn't really a big challenge because, like what I said, most of our staff, only maybe 3 staff members were under the living wage then. So it's only three people were being paid under the $23.65. So it was just a matter of us increasing their wages and then us applying for as a living wage employer. Yeah.
So how many people do you employ, Ria?
We have 18 staff members now across 2 sites.
Well, inflation is running hot. We all know it. 7.2% was the figure revealed yesterday. How is your business coping with that? Because a lot of the products that you use, well, the prices of them would have gone up a lot.
Yes. Like every business, we've been experiencing price rises even up to now. So on average, we've had probably up to 30% price increases. Cost of goods. We have obviously increased our pricing, and we've developed we've managed to develop a lot of efficiencies within our operation so that when we make something, we make a lot of it instead of making one thing of this, 2 things of that. So there's a lot of things that we've done to make our work efficient. We always look at our numbers week to week. We forecast our sales, and we make our labor budget and our cost of goods budget based on our sales. So I guess it's from the start being in tune with our business and making sure that, as our business grows, then also our staff members grow with us. So our turnover is quite low, I guess. On average, our staff stay for at least 2 years, which I think is great for hospitality. And they're able to, move forward to, bigger things than what they're currently doing. So I think it's good for everyone, good for the business and good for the staff.
So, Ria, you've acknowledged that you pass on some of these costs, obviously, to your customers. Are they aware that you are a living wage business, and does it matter to them?
It matters to some. So our community, our customer base, we're quite fortunate that they're not very price sensitive. So if we increase our regular flat white by 50 cents or 20 cents, they really don't mind much, because what we also built from the start is our hospitality, like being hospitable to people and building our community. So we have a lot of regular guests, and they come in every day, and we know that they will come back the next day or the next week. So then we're able to forecast our business quite well. And I think that's the big challenge in hospitality, especially, is forecasting, okay, next week, how much money am I going to make, or what will our sales be next week? So we've gotten really, I guess, we've understood our business enough that we can forecast, and we know that we'll be able to meet those KPIs.
So what do you say to some critics who say hospitality doesn't pay enough, and if businesses cannot afford to make this jump to a living wage, well, then they shouldn't be in business?
I believe so, because you're in business to, like most hospitality business, it's a people business. We rely heavily on people. So people make the products. So then the products that they make, we have to make sure that they're the right products for the right, I guess, level of skills and the right business model, so that everything financially, everything in the business works.
So, Ria, would you support a rise in the minimum wage to $23.65 across the board?
Yes, definitely. I think it's with all the, living expenses have risen dramatically. And I think it's just fair for, all businesses to increase everyone's wages, not just people who earn less than the living wage, but, everyone, because I think if you look after your people first, and they'll look after you in return, I think.
Great to talk to you, Ria. Thank you for your time. That's Ria Lingard, and her Pukekohe business is called Your Local Coffee Roasters, and she pays the living wage to her staff, $23.65, and started doing that, as she said, during COVID. It is 13 minutes past 6, and you're a Checkpoint on RNZ National. The US has confirmed it's sending 31 tanks to Ukraine after pleas from Kiev and President Volodymyr Zelensky. Yesterday, Germany announced it would do the same, ahead of an expected major Russian offensive at the end of winter. CNN's Phil Mattingly has this report.
We are fully, thoroughly, totally united.
For President Biden, a diplomatic breakthrough with dramatic battlefield implications.
Today, I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion.
U.S. tanks set to significantly expand Ukraine's battlefield capabilities.
It makes it possible for Germany, but also for other European NATO allies, to provide Leopard 2 battle tanks to Ukraine, and that will significantly strengthen their combat capabilities.
At the same moment, Europe's largest land war in 80 years sits in its most brutal and grinding phase.
These tanks are further evidence of our enduring, unflagging commitment to Ukraine.
And after weeks of U.S. officials dismissing the idea as untenable, with complex operating systems and significant maintenance requirements.
The maintenance and the high cost that it would take to maintain an Abrams is it just doesn't make sense to provide that to the Ukrainians at this moment.
But their inclusion, a central demand from German officials in order to clear the way for more immediate delivery of their own tanks, and to sign off on the delivery of German-made tanks by other allies. Now the trigger for a deal to unleash significant armor contributions from U.S. allies across Europe.
Germany has really stepped up. The Chancellor's been a strong, strong voice for unity.
Biden's praise of German Chancellor Scholz, intentional, officials said, even as it served to cover intense and often frustrating negotiations over the last several weeks, but ultimately leading to U.S. commitments that will take months, if not longer, to reach the battlefield.
Delivering these tanks to the field is going to take time. Time that we'll use to make sure the Ukrainians are fully prepared to integrate the Abrams tanks into their defenses.
But those commitments unlock immediate results from allies.
The American contribution will be joined by an additional announcement, including that will be readily available and more easily integrated for use in the battlefield in the coming weeks and months from other countries.
The Russian ambassador to Germany declaring the moves, quote, extremely dangerous, that take the conflict to a, quote, new level of confrontation. But U.S. officials downplayed the escalatory risk, as did Biden.
There is no offensive threat to Russia. If Russian troops return to Russia, they'll be there where they belong. This war would be over today.
And as Western nations step up their military support for Ukraine, the mood in the country remains defiant. The war may have stalled, but fierce battles still lie ahead. And the BBC's Andrew Harding has more from the southern city of Zaporizhia.
Ukrainian tanks, half a century old, battling near the front lines. In this area, close to the Donbass town of Bakhmut, Russian forces are slowly gaining ground. And when we visited this tank unit last week, the mood seemed close to despair.
Both sides have heavy losses, but we need more equipment, we need more weapons. We appreciate the support of our partners, Britain, USA and European.
No surprise then today to find many Ukrainians celebrating the news that modern Western tanks will soon be on their way here. At a bus stop in the frontline city of Zaporizhia, Vasily tells me Russia has better weapons than we do, so this is good news. A pensioner called Victoria isn't so sure. You start with tanks, she says, but then it escalates. I'm afraid this will end in a nuclear war. But when another woman, Elena, overhears that, she comes over to disagree. We need any weapons from any countries to help us kick the Russians out of here and protect our borders. Moscow's forces are not far away from here. On the road towards the front line, we pass tank traps, ready to help block any new Russian advance. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have made it pretty clear that they are planning to launch major new offensives, perhaps within a matter of weeks. The question now is whether these new Western tanks are going to arrive soon enough and in large enough numbers to make a real difference in this next phase of the conflict. For now, Ukraine continues to fight with what it has. And a senior officer who agreed to meet us close to the front said victory was certain, with or without foreign help.
The Russians keep attacking us in human waves and suffer enormous casualties. I believe we can withstand this. It's just a matter of time before we win.
Ukrainian tanks charge forwards, but it may still be a while before modern Western machines are fighting alongside them.
The assistant principal at an American primary school where a teacher was shot by a 6-year-old pupil has resigned. The school has been slammed for not heeding warnings about the child earlier this month. CNN's Brian Todd has this report.
This should have never happened. It was preventable. And thank God Abby is alive.
The attorney for Abby Zwerner, the teacher who was shot and wounded by a 6-year-old student in her first grade class, says she will file a lawsuit against the Newport News School District.
Had the school administrators acted in the interest of their teachers and their students, Abby would not have sustained a gunshot wound to the chest, a bullet that remains dangerously inside her body.
Attorney Diane Toscano alleging a dramatic timeline of warnings on the day of the shooting. The first coming around 11:15 a.m. when Zwerner warned an administrator the 6-year-old threatened to beat up another student.
They didn't call security. They didn't remove the student from the classroom.
Later at 12:30, another teacher searched the boy's backpack, suspecting he had brought the gun to school and put it in his pocket before recess.
The administrator downplayed the report from the teacher and the possibility of a gun, saying, and I quote, "Well, he has little pockets." This is outrageous.
Around 1 p.m., a third teacher told administrators a distressed student confessed to seeing the gun at recess.
Did administrators call the police? No. Did administrators lock down the school? No.
Diane Toscano says another teacher was then denied permission to search the child. CNN reached out to the school district, which declined to comment. On the agenda at a special school board meeting tonight, a vote to approve a separation agreement with Superintendent George Parker III and name a potential interim superintendent, a move parents like Mark Garcia Sr. are calling for.
Different principal, different administration.
Thomas Britton's son is in the same class as the alleged shooter, but wasn't in school that day. His response to the allegations?
I told my wife after we saw it, I'll leave the expletives out, but I can't believe someone could be so blasé or callous with the safety. Like, what is their job?
Today's allegations likely little comfort for the students and parents getting their first chance since the shooting to return to the school this afternoon. Not for classes, but for a short reorientation. An effort to give students and staff what may feel like a far-off sense of normalcy.
My son is still scared, and he was crying about 3 nights ago about this. And, you know, he wants to go back to school, but he just wants to know that he's going to be safe.
In the UK, the Labour Party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has accused the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, of being hopelessly weak for failing to sack his party's chairperson. It's emerged this week that Nadhim Zahawi had to pay a tax penalty when he was Chancellor. Labour says it shows how detached the richest people in the UK are from the rest of society. The BBC's Chris Mason has more.
Is the Conservative Party chairman done for?
Wednesday means Prime Minister's question time.
Are you going to have to sack your party chairman, Prime Minister?
Last week, Rishi Sunak said Nadhim Zahawi's tax affairs have been addressed in full. But we now know he'd paid a massive tax bill and a penalty to the tax authority.
Questions to Prime Minister.
And so the Labour leader asked,
does the Prime Minister agree that any politician who seeks to avoid the taxes they owe in this country is not fit to be in charge of taxpayer money?
No issues were raised with me when he was appointed to his current role. And since I commented on this matter last week, more information has come forward.
The Prime Minister suggested that while it would have been tempting to sack Nadhim Zahawi this morning, that would have been wrong.
The politically expedient thing to do would be for me to have said that this matter must have been resolved by Wednesday at noon. But I believe in proper due process.
And so an inquiry is underway. Nadhim Zahawi is a multi-millionaire. While he was Chancellor last summer and so in charge of the country's finances, he was also sorting out his own with Revenue and Customs. Back in the Commons, it was the Prime Minister's family's vast wealth that featured next. It emerged last year his wife had legally avoided millions of pounds of UK tax before saying she would pay it from then on.
We all know why the Prime Minister was reluctant to ask his party chair questions about family finances and tax avoidance. but his failure to sack him, when the whole country can see what's going on, shows how hopelessly weak he is.
When I disagreed fundamentally with the previous Prime Minister, I resigned from the government. But for 4 long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North.
A reference to former leader Jeremy Corbyn, who Mr Starmer as leader later kicked out of the parliamentary party.
That's what's weak, Mr Speaker. He has no principles and just petty politics.
A midwinter tussle over political strength or its absence, the backdrop, the loitering mist hanging over the tax affairs of a former Chancellor.
Hollywood is still abuzz about this year's Oscar nominations, and one film is on everyone's radar is the Indian hit RRR. The film's popular tune Natu Natu is up for Best Song. CNN's Vaidika Sudha has more.
It has explosions, epic battles, larger-than-life action scenes, and a man wrestling a tiger. India's latest blockbuster movie, RRR, Rise, Roar, Revolt, has been making waves around the world. Triumphing over Rihanna and Taylor Swift's soundtracks at the Golden Globes, RRR was awarded the Best Original Song for Natu Natu. The action fantasy film about real-life Indian revolutionaries fighting against colonialism has earned an Oscar nomination, a rare moment for an Indian film.
See, when we initially set out to make, we don't have the critical acclaim in mind. We set out to make the movie for the audience, for them to love it, for them to experience the movie.
RRR has already grossed more than $150 million worldwide and stayed for 16 weeks on the list of top 10 most viewed non-English films on Netflix. Critics say the film is a breath of fresh air for the American audience.
There's just something fresh and unique about it where I think it's going to be hard to, if Hollywood tries to do it, it's going to be hard to recapture that lightning in a bottle that this movie seems to do.
Director S.S. Rajamouli is known for his bombastic and maximalist action scenes. The film's budget, a reported $68 million, makes it one of the most expensive Indian films to date, far below most Hollywood blockbusters. The movie's overseas success is being celebrated back home. India's Prime Minister Modi personally congratulated the filmmakers after their win at the Golden Globes, saying this prestigious honor has made every Indian very proud. Hollywood has opened its doors to non-English films in recent years, and like Parasite, which became the first foreign language film to win the Oscar for Best Picture, Critics say RRR's Oscar nomination is pushing boundaries.
Sad news today for Muppet lovers. Lloyd Morissette, the co-creator of the iconic children's TV series Sesame Street, has died aged 93. The American psychologist came up with the idea of using TV to teach children basics like letters and numbers. Sesame Street went to air in the US in 1969 and it's still showing around the world today. Here's the BBC's Colin Patterson.
Few people have changed the lives of more children in the US than Lloyd Morissette. Born in Oklahoma in 1929, he worked in experimental education, exploring how to reach children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The light bulb moment came in 1965, when one morning he woke to see his 3-year-old daughter staring at the test card and wondered if the addictive nature of TV could be harnessed for good. Teaming up with the producer Joan Gans-Cooney, they created the Children's Television Workshop and in 1969 launched their first show, Sesame Street.
Oh, rubber ducky, you're the one.
The idea, make it so enjoyable that kids learned without even realising. Puppets including Cookie Monster teaching them about letters.
C is for cookie, that's good enough for me.
And numbers.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
The US Department of Education once estimated that 86% of American children had seen the show before they went to school.
11, 12.
Celebrity cameos became the norm, including, at the height of their fame, R.E.M. Sesame Street is still shown in more than 150 countries, and Lloyd Morissette was involved right to the end of his life, serving on the Sesame Workshop board at the age of 93.
Well, we're almost out of time. The last word goes to David M., who has got in touch about the interview we did with Ria Lingad, who is a cafe owner in Pukekohe. David says your local roasters had the best coffee in Pukekohe, my daily cafe of choice to scoot round to. She pays her staff the living wage. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō. Tomorrow from 5 a.m. on First Up, the future of one of the country's oldest hotels is in limbo after it shuts down new bookings for 2023 and 2024. First Up, we'll have the story.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Tēnā tātou ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Police say the child who died at Waikanai Beach in Gisborne yesterday was 12 years old. They say there appears to have been a tragic accident on the beach where logs have been washing up after extreme weather. Kiwi Rail has confirmed a vehicle collided with a shunt train in Invercargill this afternoon. 2 people were injured, 1 seriously. An immigrant farm worker has appeared in court accused of shooting dead 7 people in Half Moon Bay near the US city of San Francisco. Chun Li Zhao, 66, did not plead. And the Prime Minister says changes to immigration are a definite possibility to ease the country's labour shortage. But Chris Hipkins says it's important to get more New Zealanders into the workforce. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7 o'clock.
Tonight on Nights, we welcome back Claire Concannon with Our Changing World, and tonight they're investigating the potential of greening our city walls, and they're looking for solutions for data storage, the healing power of forests in treating depression and addiction, and music with Lost and Found, lost classics and curious cuts from New Zealand and beyond. That's all on Nights with Karen Hay, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And we're funded through New Zealand On Air. Now it's time for Trending Now with me, Evie Ashton. If you feel like your attention span has reduced in recent years, you are not alone. Cognitive psychologist and professor of informatics at the University of California, Irvine, Dr. Gloria Mark, has been studying human-to-computer interaction since the mid-1990s and the field of distraction since 2004. She's found that we spend an average of just 47 seconds on any screen before shifting our attention, that it takes 25 minutes to bring our attention back to a task after an interruption, and that we interrupt ourselves more than we're interrupted by others. But Dr. Mark is optimistic about our chances of taking back control of our devices and our attention. She speaks to 9 to Noon's Catherine Ryan about how our brains function in the digital world. And she has tips for how we can fight distraction from her new book, Attention Span, Finding Focus for a Fulfilling Life.
I started studying this back in 2004, and I'm a scientist. I wanted to be very objective. So back then, we would shadow people with stopwatches. So we would, follow them around in their real world environments. Usually this was offices. And we would time them every time they switched their attention on a screen. And at the time in 2004, we found the average attention on any screen to be about 2.5 minutes. But then came along very sophisticated computer logging methods. So we didn't have to follow people around. We could measure people's time on a screen. And we found that the attention spans have diminished over time. In 2011-12, we found it to be about 75 seconds on average. And in the last 5-6 years, we find it averaging about 47 seconds. It's not just my research. Others have also done similar kinds of studies and have come up with results within a few seconds. So it's a very robust result.
Can you give us an example of how this is happening? 47 seconds sounds like nothing, but can it be as simple as I'm looking at one computer screen, then I pick up my mobile phone and check if there's any texts, and then I have a quick flick onto what's happening on my social feed? Like, could you give us an example of how those numbers might play out?
Yeah. So the example you gave is very accurate. So first of all, let me say that people check email on average 77 times a day. So a lot of what they're doing is changing attention to their email. But yeah, a person might be working on, say, a Word document, they're working on a budget, and then they switch their attention to looking at news, social media. They might switch it to another project. You mentioned that people are just as likely to switch of their own accord. That we tend to self-interrupt. That interruptions originate from within us, and it's just remarkable to watch someone when they do this, because they seem to be focusing, say, writing on a document, and then suddenly, for no apparent reason, they suddenly stop and switch to, let's say, Wikipedia or the internet or social media, and then they might switch to a different task. So,
do you have a hypothesis on what we're doing? Is it that little dopamine hit thing, or is it a little micro break? Why are we doing it?
There's a lot of reasons why we're doing it. We self-interrupt because we have an urge to look up information. And of course, we're sitting in front of the world's largest candy store. So it's so easy. It's perhaps too easy to look up information. We might have a memory. We forgot to make a phone call or to answer an email. It turns out that research shows if you have any kind of unfinished task, that memory of that task stays with you and nags you. And so as we're switching our attention constantly, we're leaving so many unfinished tasks behind, and they stay on the back burners of our minds and remind us that, we should get back to them. There are other kinds of reasons. The very design of the internet itself, with its node and link structure, is designed to distract us because it maps on so well the way human memory is theorized to be structured, like a semantic network. We think in terms of associations. When When I hear cat, I think of dog. And so when we go on, say, a Wikipedia page or we go on the internet, there are so many possible entry points to our mind's network. And once we start reading something on the internet, it sparks off other ideas, and then there's just this whole firestorm in our
the dreaded
minds.
rabbit hole. Well, let's look at getting back. We'll look at the implications and getting back to the task you were doing initially, because I found this so interesting and so true, that after that distraction, it can take a full 25 minutes to get back to the project that you were on. And what I found so interesting was it will almost inevitably be through a diversion onto a third project.
Yes. Yeah, that's the pattern that we find. So if we look at people's work in terms of the projects, right? You're working on one project, you switch to another, then you start to work on another, and then you go back to the original project. So it's not as though you're interrupted and then immediately go back, but we find that there's intervening work that people do.
Let's talk about why it matters, and perhaps we should get into this concept of attention states. We know what it's like to be in very deep concentration, most of us anyway, at some point, whether it's studying or trying to get a big project finished, and you're really deep in it and you're really thinking and working hard. And then we know the flibbity-gibbet states, which tend to be perhaps creeping more and more into our lives. What are they, and what's happening in the brain when we're in these different states?
Right. So you're right. When we're focused on something, it requires mental effort. We're engaged with it, and we have to exert some kind of effort. And that is stressful. It's not necessarily bad until we exceed our threshold of just the amount of mental resources we have available. We have a limited amount of resources. We can't focus all day because there's mental effort involved. In the same way, we can't lift weights all day without getting exhausted. So another kind of attention is to be engaged with something without a lot of mental effort. And that could be playing solitaire, or playing a simple game, or doing something like knitting. There's lots of things we can do. And so we find that people have rhythms of focused attention. Most people are at their peaks around 11 a.m. in the morning and mid-afternoon between 2 and 3. But it corresponds with the ebb and flow of the attentional resources we have available. And once our resources start to fade, then people usually switch and do something less effortful.
So are we overall losing the amount of time we are spending in a deep concentrative state, or indeed in a flow state, which is the dream, right? When everything's just, whatever you're doing, everything just seems to be happening for you. Are we spending proportionately less time in those states and more in what I've dubbed the flibbity-gibbet state, or as you've described it, perhaps less taxing exercises? And that might be surfing the web.
I think it's what we do is we go back and forth between these different states. I don't think it's fair to say that we spend most of our time in this kind of engaged state without having mental effort. I think the important thing is for people to be intelligent about how they switch between these different states. And what I mean by that is that when you start to feel exhausted, then it's time to pull back. And, the best thing we can do is take a break, because otherwise we get exhausted. So I don't think it's the case that people are spending more time in this kind of what I call rote activity, things that don't require mental effort, like surfing the web, being on social media. I just think we're going about it in the wrong way.
Before we get to your tips, are there concerns, though, about, and this is a perception, right? Perhaps for a generation that's come through that's digital natives, right, and extraordinarily able it appears to those of us who've remembered pre-digital times, to move among all these devices and to be competent and to deliver, right? But is that generation in any way lacking in a deep and prolonged concentration or contemplative state, such as you might have by reading a very long novel or just by actually doing nothing and just internally contemplating? Is there any evidence they're lacking anything because they've been device engaged their whole lives?
So we've not seen strong differences over ages. Young people are as susceptible as older people are in terms of switching their attention. The concern I have is when we talk about very young kids, because there's a part of the brain called executive function that's not yet very mature. And that's the part of the brain that helps us regulate. It helps us set priorities of where we want to focus our attention. And when we see really young kids, in front of screens, and of course they're susceptible to all kinds of distractions, that's not good, because they don't have the maturity yet in their executive function to be able to control themselves. When that gets mature, when kids get a little bit older, then we see less of an age difference in terms of, being switching attention.
Gloria Mark is our guest. We're talking about her book, Attention Span, Finding Focus for a Fulfilling Life. Now, this is research she's been doing specifically on the field of distraction since 2004, although human-to-computer interaction's been a subject of research since the mid-1990s. I mentioned flow before, which is that state, whether you're an athlete or a writer or any kind of performance, where you just seem to be in this optimum concentration and actually it doesn't feel particularly taxing and everything's just coming together. In your book, you write that rhythm is the new flow. Can you explain?
Yes. So you're right that flow is the ideal state. It's the optimal state when we can be creative, when we have all this energy, when time just doesn't seem to matter. The problem is that if you're not an artist, if you're not a musician, if you don't do something like woodworking or ceramics, the nature of work you do is just not going to be conducive to flow. If you're a knowledge worker of any kind, and that means that the primary task you do, your primary work deals with some kind of digital information, the work you do is just not conducive to getting into a flow state. Why? Because we tend to use an analytical mindset. That's what I use when I do my work, writing papers, conducting research. I'm using analytical thinking. I'm not in flow. So the more important thing to think of is to be aware of when your attentional capacity is at its peak and when it's not. And when it's at its peak, that's when you can do more. That's when you should schedule your hardest tasks, the task where you want to be the most creative, because that's when you have the most attentional resources available. So when I talk about rhythm as the new flow, it means being aware of your own personal rhythm of when your resources are at their